Hi, this is Rojin Mukriyan from the Amargi. Today I have the honor to be joined by Farzan Sabet to discuss the Iran war, the possibility of a US-Iran peace deal, and its broader consequences for the Iranian people. Farzan Sabet is an analyst, consultant, and researcher focused on Middle East security and politics, sanctions, and nuclear non-proliferation. Farzan, thank you for accepting our invitation and welcome to the Amargi.
Rojin, thank you very much for inviting me. A pleasure to be on.
Thank you so much. Before discussing the ceasefire, I would like to ask your opinion on this. And we hear more often that the US President Donald Trump repeatedly says that, quote unquote, we have had regime change in Iran, suggesting that those now in charge are more reasonable. What is your assessment of this claim? Do you think we have had regime change in Iran?
I absolutely don't think that we've had regime change in Iran. I think what President Trump was going for was Venezuela operation style regime modification, where he hoped that by decapitating the top political and security leadership of the Islamic Republic, he would then reshape the regime in such a way that it would be more accommodating in terms of U.S. and to a lesser extent Israeli demands. That hasn't necessarily happened. If anything, the leadership that is in place now is at least equally hardline to the one that left, or potentially more so. Although in the framework of broader U.S. Iran talks, there may be some greater latitude for concessions, but nothing that would suggest a meaningful regime change or even a regime transformation in the direction that the U.S. wanted has taken place.
Yeah, thank you. I think you shed light on many great points, which, like so far, if we consider that the ultimate objective of this war for the U.S. was decapitating the regime in Iran, or to basically to have another Venezuela case in Iran, we see that, yeah, I think I agree that we cannot say that this so far happened in Iran. But now we're in 10 days into a fragile 2 week ceasefire between Iran and the US. And we know that the two countries recently held their first high-level face-to-face talks in Islamabad. It happened last week. And also we heard that the Vice President J.D. Vance, leading the U.S. Delegate, stated that, quote, again, unquote, the person who effectively runs Iran was sitting alongside the U.S. Vice President. Do we have any clarity on who currently holds real power in Iran? Is Vance referring to the Iranian parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf? Is he now the ultimate decision making in Iran, do you think?
That's a good question. I think that Vice President J.D. Vance was probably speaking about Speaker of Parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Is he effectively the ruler of the Islamic Republic? I don't think that's the case, at least in the way that he probably means it. We have to be kind of intellectually honest and say that we don't have a firm grasp, or we can't say for sure at least who's in charge in Iran. The amount of information that's verifiable out of Iran, especially under conditions of the digital blackout that's taking place there, is quite limited. If I had to guess, I would say that the structure of power remains somewhat comparable to what existed before, with some important differences. I would say that Mojtaba Khamenei, to the extent that he's able to have influence, continues probably to sign off on high-level decisions, but is probably far less involved in day-to-day decision making than his father, the former Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was. This is probably partly due to physical injury that he is believed to have sustained during the war. It's also for security reasons, uh, given that he's probably hunkered down, seeking to avoid Israeli assassination attempts. It's probably not communicating electronically or with high frequency to prevent himself from being tracked down. But I would say that when it comes to the high level decisions, he probably, if he's not incapacitated, retains some kind of broad oversight. In terms of day-to-day management of the war effort and domestic security, I think we can confidently say that that's in the hands of the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, the IRGC. Um, in terms of managing the country more broadly and Iran's diplomatic effort, there I think Speaker of Parliament Ghalibaf is probably first among equals, the kind of the most influential, technically civilian figure inside in Iran. Although I would say that he's probably playing more of a coordination role rather than making the decisions by himself. I think the fact that Iran's delegation at the Islamabad talks was so large points to efforts to create consensus by Ghalibaf, both among important power centers, but also different political currents. Many of the figures on the delegation did not necessarily have to be there from the perspective of the technical aspects of the talks themselves. My sense is that, and what I've heard from my contacts, is that they were there as part of attempting to create political consensus, since there has been a certain level of regime decapitation and a very high volume of the country's top political and security leadership have been killed or incapacitated. So this points to, again, Ghalibaf being very influential, but probably playing a more coordinating role when it comes to both running civil affairs as well as managing diplomacy.
Yeah, I think it is a very complicated situation, and considering the digital blackout, I think made assessment very difficult. But at the same time, you mentioned the Islamabad talks, and what is interesting it is that after the first round of these talks, we saw basically nothing but just a U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports. And after that, but now we see reports that both Iran and the US getting ready for the maybe potential second rounds of talks. And we more increasingly see that both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance suggest that the gap between the two countries is narrowing and that progress has been made. This is something that we recently, in the last few days, we hear a lot. Do you think that we are approaching the end of the conflict? Because you mentioned Ghalibaf, that he has a coordinating kind of role, but it is at the same time powerful and effective role. And we see him, especially in X, that from his tweets, he's very constrained and not try to be very harsh or to project power, or he's willing to actually give concession and he's more soft than before. Do you think that this is a signal that they are ready to give concession and we are close to the end of this war?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it's hard to say for sure. The timing of when the ceasefire was announced and subsequently when talks started corresponds with U.S. President Donald Trump's threat to conduct large-scale attacks against Iran's critical and energy infrastructure, specifically its electricity production capacity. Um, that signals to me that although President Trump was probably looking for some kind of off-ramp from having to follow through with that threat, at the same time, it's possible that the Iranian position also softened. and they backed down to some extent and showed greater willingness both to engage with the U.S. as well as to potentially make concessions. We have to remember that this is the U.S. kind of administration that has killed, by my account, dozens of the Islam Republic's senior leaders, from Supreme Leader Khamenei all the way to former Islamic IRGC Jerusalem Force Commander Major General Qasem Soleimani. So the fact that the Iranian side were willing to sit down and conduct face-to-face negotiations at such a high level with the United States shows to some extent that their position probably also softened after many leaders, including Ghalibaf himself, specifically said that they would not accept a temporary ceasefire. Right. At the same time, does that tell us that there's going to be a deal, or that the ceasefire will last? It's possible that we enter a period of ceasefire. It could be a ceasefire where we see no major hostilities between the two sides. It could be a hostile ceasefire where there is limited overt or covert strikes by the U.S. and Israel against Iran, and vice versa, by Iran against U.S., Israel, and to some extent also the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Um, I think that remains quite possible, especially if the Islam Republic is willing to back off its effective control over the Strait of Hormuz, and kind of managing the traffic through the strait, and charging a toll. If the Islam Republic is willing to back off that demand, I think we could see a ceasefire. Does that imply a deal? I think, President Trump would probably be willing to accept a type of deal where the U.S. doesn't have to make many concessions and Iran surrenders the Strait of Hormuz and there's a ceasefire. But this, of course, from the perspective of the Islam Republic, is not acceptable because it would leave open the possibility of future wars. And given the serious damage that both the regime and the Iranian economy has sustained, they would want something on the other side to boost their efforts to rebuild both the regime, the security forces, the military, and of course the to boost and rebuild the economy. Um, but would they be willing to give the kind of concessions that would unlock major reciprocal concessions by the U.S.? I'm specifically thinking of kind of the high level sanctions relief. That also seems unlikely. While from everything we've heard from these talks, the Islam Republic has potentially softened its position somewhat around the nuclear issue. When it comes to the other big two issues that President Trump has consistently highlighted since actually the 12-day war, that is the missile issue and proxies, we have so far not heard any signals that they are willing to make meaningful concessions. So I think there's maybe a mismatch in terms of the what both sides are willing to do, and the expectations. Trump is willing to take kind of an easy off ramp from the conflict. He would also be happy with a kind of a large, comprehensive agreement where the Iranian make major concessions, but they also get major concessions in return, namely the comprehensive lifting of sanctions and even U.S. investment. I think looking at what happened in Venezuela, that this is quite possible. But given the Islam Republic are not willing to give that broader set of concessions on those three major issues, that makes that higher level deal unlikely. This leaves us with they want something more in the middle between those two, which I think is probably not acceptable to the U.S. Although some of the signals we're getting from the talks, at least in the press, is to the contrary. So it's possible they land there. But with all that said, it seems like we're likely to see something possibly on the lower end of the spectrum, where there are some limited concessions by Iran. But of course, they back off control of the Strait of Hormuz, which is an important kind of new U.S. objective that emerged during the war. The U.S. Possibly gives some limited sanctions relief, for example, in terms of allowing Iran to access certain assets that were either frozen or inaccessible abroad. This would be politically problematic for the Trump administration. If you remember, the President Trump, as well as many figures in his orbit, made much of former President Barack Obama kind of transferring so-called pallets of cash to the Iranians. If the Trump administration does the same without having received major concessions across the range of issues, not only the nuclear issues, he would open himself up to similar criticism. But something on the lower end with limited Iranian concessions, releasing the Strait of Hormuz, maybe some things around the nuclear program, limited sanctions relief by the U.S. That does remain, I think, that's a strong possibility than the other kind of two scenarios that we've discussed.
Okay, I think you brought many issues to our talk, and I want to ask few questions on this. First, it appears that you are not very optimistic about any potential deal between the two countries, at least to say in a short-term period. But how about this scenario? We heard from Al Jazeera yesterday, made a report that, the US and Iran making progress. And yes, we know that now Iran has accepted to freeze the enrichment of uranium inside Iran, but there is disagreement about its duration, like the US proposing a 20-year moratorium and Iran offering 5 years. But many observers, including Pakistanis, they think that there is a middle way for this. And another issue is that the talk and the fate of this Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, which again, the US wants to remove it and Iran wants to keep it, but to dilute it to lower levels of 3%. And many also believe that there is also a middle ground for this. And what we hear from the US administration, particularly from the US President Donald Trump, is that 99% of these talks are about nuclear program, that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapon or the equipment to that is necessary for having such a weapon. So if Iran and the US to solve nuclear issue, then you don't think that the issue of the Strait of Hormuz can be tackled also easily? For example, we see again, Trump indicates or signals that he actually doesn't mind to have a share of that Iran's idea to put a charging tool in tolls in the Strait of Hormuz. So if Iran to offer to give a share maybe to the United States, maybe Trump will be willing to accept that. Do you think it is kind of a scenario like this possible? You already kind of discussed that,
Yeah.
and you are not optimistic, but still, do you think that still there is a chance for this deal to happen? And if not, what is the alternative?
I think it's very important to dig a bit deeper into this issue. You highlight an important issue. So something, first we have to ask ourselves, what is a broad U.S. kind of grand strategic goal in pursuing a maximum pressure and this current war? Something that we've consistently heard, or I consistently heard before Trump's second term from former Trump officials. And I heard once Trump was in power for a second term, I started to hear it from former Biden officials, but it's not necessarily something we hear kind of highlighted very strongly in the mainstream media coverage. Is that the kind of grand strategy goal of the U.S. kind of efforts towards Iran and the Islamic Republic, especially by the now the Trump administration, is to basically remove Iran as an adversary by the end of this decade, so that they can put a lot of their focus on the conflict with China and focus their resources, military assets there. Something, for example, that a former Biden administration official told me before this war was that it was not necessarily very sustainable for the U.S. to pursue competition and confrontation on the military level with China if it was consistently being forced to deploy a large number of its naval and air assets to the Middle East, to the west of Asia, to the Mediterranean, to the Red Sea, to in and around kind of the region to confront Iran or a member of the kind of axis of resistance while it was trying to confront China. This would be a consistent drain on U.S. resources, and so the U.S. objective broadly is to remove Iran adversary. That can be done from a U.S. perspective, and to a lesser extent from the Israeli perspective, in a number of ways. One is what we kind of already discussed, which is regime modification, right? It's the same regime, but it's transformed such that it is no longer a U.S. adversary. The kind of consequence of that would be that West Asia, as we know it, would become basically a continuous zone of U.S. At least political hegemony. Um, we've seen something similar already start happening in Latin America, right? With what happened in Venezuela and what's happening now in Cuba, right? So there's some comparisons to be made there. So that's kind of the broad objective. That can be done through regime modification. That can be done through regime change. That can be done by collapsing the Iranian state, effectively destroying the Iranian state. The U.S. can achieve those objectives through that broad objective through any of those. Um, if the Islamic Republic basically agrees to making across the board concessions, not only on the nuclear issue, but on the nuclear missile, maybe there'll be some additional things thrown in on drones, and the proxy issue, and is willing to credibly signal that it is no longer a U.S. adversary, and there's a number of things that would need to do there, including ending the conflict with Israel, then I think from the perspective of President Trump and everything we've seen from him, anything is possible. Not only comprehensive sanctions lifting, right? But even creating a toll booth on the Strait of Hormuz, right? In order to and sharing the profits, right? Building a Trump Tower in Tehran, right? This is kind of a reality that I think many haven't really internalized. The question is the Islamic Republic willing to make the kinds of concessions to unlock that level of sanctions lifting and kind of broader economic activity? Everything we've seen, even from this kind of third Islamic Republic that we've now entered, points that not being the case, right? They're willing to make concessions on the nuclear program, and like I said, that could unlock, for example, limited sanctions relief, such as the kind of being able to access some frozen Iranian assets, numbering potentially in the billions of dollars. They would in turn need to release the Strait of Hormuz and kind of cooperate in the resumption of global traffic through the strait. That's not, but that limited cooperation it is not what is required to unlock that bigger kind of more comprehensive deal. Um, I think one of the ways we know if they were preparing to agree to such a comprehensive deal, right, was if they would be preparing their social base, right, their hardline social base, which is one of the key pillars of the regime. They would be basically preparing them psychologically through kind of state media and in other ways that this is what we have to do for the survival of the regime, right? That, in my view, unless you have a figure like the founder of the Islamic Republic, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had the power to impose that very rapidly, in the absence of a figure like that or a regime with that level of political power and social hegemony, which the Islamic Republic today doesn't really possess, preparing your social base for effectively surrender and capitulation to the U.S., it's a slightly longer term process. You need to build a political coalition within the regime, within the IRGC, would need to become the dominant faction in the IRGC, and you would need to also do that within the social base. You would probably have to confront those who oppose this fundamental change of direction of the Islamic Republic. And there you would potentially see purges and crackdowns, both on elites, hardline elites, as well as the hardline social base, who would oppose this change of directions. So that takes a little bit of time. It's a process. We haven't really seen them prepare to do anything like that. So that signals to me that they're potentially willing to show greater flexibility on the nuclear issue. And for example, again, releasing the Strait of Hormuz, they're not necessarily preparing to surrender or capitulate, as far as we can see. On the other hand, will the Trump administration, after so doggedly pursuing, this bigger package, give Iran comprehensive sanctions relief, right? And for example, allow it to retain control of the Strait of Hormuz while sharing revenues with the U.S. With the Trump administration, we can never rule out anything. That seems unlikely. That's why I think, again, if we reach a deal, it'll be either a ceasefire or a hostile ceasefire or a limited deal, which returns us somewhat to the status quo ante, before the kind of status quo before the war. But at the same time, the Islamic Republic that would be left then would be significantly weakened compared to what it was before, and that's precisely the scenario they're trying to avoid. But that seems to be the direction of travel. But we'll have to wait and see.
Farzan, to go back a little bit, you alluded to the point that part of the U.S. objective in this war is to bring an end to the Iran's adversary toward the U.S. But we know that from the Iranian perspective down to the U.S., it was always simultaneous with the down to Israel. And Israel is in the region, okay? It's like the U.S. is far away geographically speaking. We know that there is a strong security tie between the US and Israel, but the objectives are completely different. So now the question is, even if like the Iranian officials or regime somehow to decide to modify themselves to end adversary with the US, but do you think they can also normalize their relationship with Israel? Considering that adversary against Israel or down to Israel, from my perspective, is one of the important pillar of the Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy, like how they can justify their expansionist ambitions without creating or projecting that they have one absolute enemy called Israel, how they can justify attracting all what they call axis of resistance. So do you think is it possible? Because we all forget that it's not just a war between the US and Iran, okay? Israel is part of this, okay? And now in this negotiation, again, Israel is missing. It's not on the table. It's a negotiation between Iran and the US. So do you think it's like considering Israel factor here, a lasting peace, even if the Iranian official to decide to modify themselves is possible without Iran and Israel, both of them decide to end their adversary toward each other?
That's an excellent question. I think one misunderstanding that exists in Tehran about dealing with the U.S. is the Islamic Republic feels like it can, for example, try to reach détente, a rapprochement, and kind of normalization of ties with the U.S. while carving out and avoiding the Israel issue. But if we go back to the post-Iran-Iraq war, kind of that first decade of the Islamic Republic, decade of kind of revolution, war, and then leadership change, if we look at the period after that, many of the Islamic Republic's attempts to reach a détente and rapprochement with the United States have been at least partly unwound or undone by the fact that they tried to avoid or go around the Israel issue, but that always came back to them. That was somewhat the case very recently with, in the last decade with the JCPOA. And again, with the U.S.-Iran talks, even under the Trump administration, where they, wanted to avoid it and they thought they could reach a deal with somebody like Trump, who's quite open-minded and kind of into reaching deals. But again, that we saw ahead of during the 12-day war, or in the lead up to the 12-day war, there were negotiations. There was some hope that those negotiations could unlock a deal between the U.S. and Iran. It was really the Israel factor that was a major, at least, factor in undoing those, with Israel launching a war against the Islamic Republic that came with probably at least a U.S. yellow light, if not a green light, right? So, to your kind of main question, I think it's very difficult, at least for the duration of President Trump's term, to kind of find an off ramp from the U.S.-Iran conflict and normalize ties without also resolving the conflict with Israel. But if we think of what the Islamic Republic is, especially the Second Islamic Republic as it existed under Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, right? If we had to essentialize it into a few pillars, right? What were those pillars? Nuclear program, missile program, axis of resistance, and kind of the proxy network and the destruction of Israel and liberation of Palestine, right? And of course, something like the mandatory hijab, right? So it's a bit reductionist and kind of symbolizing the issues, but these were four important pillars. Effectively, what the U.S. has asked the Islamic Republic to do, and what Israel is kind of asking to do, is make massive concessions across at least the first three of those pillars. That is the nuclear, missile, and proxy pillars, right? Well, how does a regime sustain itself if you remove its core pillars, not only ideological pillars, political pillars, but in the case of those three pillars, those were also the pillars of Iran's deterrence, which in many ways failed, but at least in the case of the missile program succeeded, managed to succeed somewhat, in terms of Iran's military capabilities, right? Can the Islamic Republic accept to have these pillars pulled out from under it? And we've seen, although it has not surrendered on the mandatory hijab issue, it's at least been forced first by the Women Life Freedom movement, and then by the Sun and Line uprising, and by the two cycles of U.S. Iran Israel kind of wars. It's been forced to essentially back off of the mandatory hijab, at least tactically, right, until it's able to stabilize domestic conditions and consolidate power. Well, then what is the Islamic Republic if not those pillars, right? For the Islamic Republic to back off the pillar of the destruction of Israel, kind of liberation of Palestine, the acts of resistance, it would require a fundamental change or transformation in the nature of the regime, such that it may even start to become unrecognizable to us. At least for the time being, we haven't seen that happening. One of the signals that we can kind of take as evidence that that's not happening yet, right, is the fact that when the U.S. Iran ceasefire came into effect, the Iranian leadership were quite quick to link it to a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon,
Yeah.
right? And that was part of their goal to maintain Hezbollah, with the hope of probably rebuilding it after the conflict.
Yes, and I think as the last question, I would like to. I know that you are not optimistic about any potential deal or peace between the US and Iran, but at the same time, for the sake of argument, let's assume that, okay, Iran has no other choice, no other alternative but to submit to the US terms and to modify itself to accept Trump's terms and to constrain at least its missile and drone capacities, constrain its proxy networking, and put a temporary halt on its nuclear program, and to turn to what the US administration calls to become a normal country. And at that case, as J.D. Vance said, that the door of the global economy is going to open to the Iranian regime and what they say to the Iranian people. But my question is this: do you think if the Iranian regime integrate into the global economy, it could lead to political opening at home? It could give a space also to the Iranian peoples, to civil society to breathe, to have freedom, to practice democracy like a normal people?
hmm That's an excellent question. I just want to clarify one thing. I think a ceasefire, a long-term ceasefire is possible. I think a limited deal remains kind of a strong possibility, right? So I think a ceasefire is likely, a limited deal is a strong possibility. I'm more skeptical about either kind of that medium deal that the Islam Republic wants, where it doesn't concede very much, but it expects to receive very much, or that comprehensive agreement. I'm more skeptical of those two scenarios. And the reason it's important, kind of whether they reach one or the other, is that in the ceasefire scenario or a limited deal scenario, that leaves the door open to future rounds of war, or at least future rounds of intensified either covert action or intensified economic pressure, right? And so the conflict continues, it simmers, risking to kind of reignite again, right? So I can see some set of deals happening. I can see other sets of deals happening are being less likely. In terms of the Islam Republic being kind of a quote unquote normal country, I think what Vice President Vance probably means there is that you have an Islam Republic which accepts U.S. hegemony in West Asia, right? And for the functional purpose of U.S. confrontation with China is aligned with the U.S. or at least not actively doing things which aid and support China, right? Um, Now, I'm sure the U.S. will say they would also like to see a regime that treats its people better and gives them greater rights. But is that likely to happen? Something we've seen with the Islamic Republic, and this goes back to its very foundation, is that it's an authoritarian regime, right? When authoritarian regimes, comparable, or if we want to kind of draw broad analogies, right? Looking at, for example, Russia after 1989, or the People's Republic of China after kind of Deng Xiaoping comes into power in the mid 1970s, mid to late 1970s, and starts to make substantial reforms there, right? Um, During periods in which those regimes were very integrated into the global economy, and enjoyed a very high level of economic prosperity, right? They at the same time maintained incredibly high levels of repression at home, and in some cases, even intensified their level of authoritarian control, both in terms of limiting the scope of opinion within the regimes, but also kind of cracking down on dissent in society. Right. We saw that take place in those other cases, right? So, I understand that argument. This kind of liberal economic liberalization and prosperity will then necessarily lead to kind of democratization, or at least kind of greater rights. I'm not necessarily, I would have to see evidence of that trajectory. In the absence of clear evidence, it's very difficult for me to believe it. During, for example, with the rise of the reform movement, right at the end of the 1990s, during President Mohammad Khatami's kind of first term, right? In Under those circumstances, there were some set of U.S. sanctions in place, but we didn't really have these kind of post 9/11, post financial crisis, very comprehensivized sanctions regimes that are quite effective. And we certainly, 1997, that was, almost a decade after the Iran-Iraq War, and we had no kind of overt U.S. Israel Iran confrontation really either in the region, to much to speak of, although there was limited attacks here or there, or direct war. The reform movement rose, under the kind of rules of the games set up by the Islam Republic and by a previous former leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And what happened? Within 2 years, effectively, the reform movement was kind of, dead is a strong word, but the reform movement was effectively hampered from following through on many of its efforts at creating substantial changes, right? That was partially because of the limits imposed by reformists on themselves, not seeking to push the boundaries of the Islam Republic too hard. But that was also functionally a response of the restraints put on it by the broader structures in the regime, including the supreme leader and the IRGC. Fast forward to the Green Movement, right? We saw something similar, right, where a faction within the regime tried to push and enhance freedoms by while still more or less playing within the rules of the game. There are serious allegations that effectively, when when a key element of the elements of the regime, power centers, going to the very top, felt that those rules of the games no longer favored them, they kind of upended them, right? And that there's strong allegations that there was an electoral coup. Then we saw a Green Movement uprising, which was brutally repressed, and then again during the Rouhani administration, where there was a lot of efforts that reforms or moderation would take place. Again, what happened? The Rouhani government was empowered to make changes in diplomacy to the extent that it benefited the Islam Republic as a regime, and helped resolve kind of its very imminent economic issues at the time, and find an off ramp from a possible confrontation with the U.S. Right? But the Rouhani government either did not make other serious efforts at reforms or moderation, or where they did, they were hamstrung by the regime. And again, come to Masoud Pezeshkian, and I'm sure this is maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but I thought him to be, of all the reformist and so-called moderate figures, I thought him to be the weakest, right? Many people thought, saw much more potential. Maybe that potential was there, maybe it wasn't. But effectively, what happened was that even, before this war, right, even before the large-scale protests, President Masoud Pezeshkian was going around saying things like, I'm effectively powerless. There's not very much I can do. So, given everything that's happened, given the mass slaughter of Iranians that we've seen, not only during the uprising in January, but for the last nearly half a century, and the war, and the fact, and the kind of succession that's taken place, right? Um, is it likely that then, with economic opening and let's say less tensions on the kind of security side, we have kind of a democratization or a substantial opening of the regime? The opposition may find opportunities for that under those circumstances. People might be more empowered to mobilize under those circumstances, but broadly speaking, no. I'm very, very skeptical, and I don't think that's happened. The Islam Republic as a regime is fundamentally an authoritarian regime. I think we're likely to see a continuity of that authoritarianism, even in expansion. And that's something we're already seeing around something like the internet, right? Where the Islam Republic is trying to restrict cyberspace, limit access to the global internet to its own supporters or those who absolutely need it, while restricting the information space, right? I think that's probably more telling of the direction of travel of the Islamic Republic, even before this war, but especially since it's happened and since the uprising in January.
Thank you so much. I think we'll leave it here, Farzan. We
Of
appreciate your
course,
valuable insights and time. Thank you so much again.
of course, my pleasure. Thank you very much.